This is our first screencast on agriculture. This is going to be Green Revolution and GMOs, and then we'll do next two sections in the screencast as well. So the Industrial Revolution has to do with, in agriculture anyway, mechanization and standardization for food production, whereas 50, 100 years ago, there were a lot of small farms and a lot of farmers produced crops in their own individual ways. It's basically been taken over by large corporations that have a standard way of doing everything, and things are generally run as automated as possible. Even things like combines, right, are not necessarily driven by people. Industrial agriculture exists because we basically give it an energy subsidy. That there's a pretty large amount of fossil fuel energy as well as human energy that's put into every calorie of food that's produced. And so there's about 10 calories of energy put into every calorie that you actually consume. That was determined by Michael Pollan, who's a pretty prominent food writer. So where does all of this 10-calorie energy go? So the fossil fuel use to make fertilizers and pesticides, fuel that's burned for running tractors and machinery, energy that's used to irrigate the fields, to get the water from underground aquifers to the fields, and then transportation of the crops from the fields to, say, grocery stores. And so if you're wondering why it's so cheap to buy a Big Mac, but salads are relatively expensive, it's because there are federal government subsidies for certain types of food production. And most of those subsidies go to meat and dairy. A very small amount of it goes to grains, and most of those grains are used for the meat and the dairy. And then other subsidies for vegetables and fruit, very small amounts. Of course, this is opposite what the federal nutrition recommendations are, right? They recommend all these grains and vegetables and fruits, but that's not where the money is going. So when we talk about the Green Revolution, it's this idea of the shift to mechanization of industrial agriculture, the increased use of fertilizer, increased use of irrigation, and generally improved types of crops over the last 100 years. But it doesn't mean green as in environmentally friendly. It's a green revolution in terms of more stuff is being grown, like larger volumes of stuff is being grown. So as far as where stuff is being grown, you can see there's a lot of croplands in the US, down in Argentina, India, there's a fair amount of croplands. Pastures are more like grassland habitats, and prairies, you can see those as well. So what exactly is this mechanization? What does it do? So it provides better economies of scale. Mechanization allows you to harvest more crops, and the more crops you harvest, the lower your cost is for each additional crop you harvest. So it makes sense for companies to grow more and more crops because their costs for growing those crops keep getting lower and lower the more crops they grow. And so there are large upfront expenditures, which are good at preventing small farmers from getting into farming, right? Because you have to buy this equipment. It's very expensive upfront. And if you only have a small amount of land that you're farming, then it doesn't make economic sense. So small farms can't compete with the large farms that can afford this large equipment. If you check out this graph in terms of number of acres that farms, the average farm tends, farms used to be smaller. Back in the early 1900s, you'd have maybe 140, 150 acre farms were the average size. Now that's more than tripled. It's almost 500 acres is the average farm size. And even that was just back in 1997. Different regions of the world have different farm sizes, of course. You can see that the average farm size in the US is the largest of any of these continents, of any of these regions. And that a lot of other nations, especially in Africa and Asia, the average farms are very small, like really small. So what does agriculture mean these days? So we tend to think of it in terms of monocropping, so that you have large fields of only one type of crop. And this, you can see, large rows of corn here. The benefits of this, it's efficient and productive because all the methods for growing the crops are the same for every plot of land. So you only need one type of equipment to harvest the corn. You only need one type of equipment to plant the corn. And so maintaining that equipment and using that equipment is cheaper if you only have the one type of crop. And so there is the economy of it there. Of course, there are major drawbacks to this. So the issue with soil erosion is that if you plot those crops, they don't grow all year necessarily. So there's downtime where the field does not have plants on it, and there's more soil erosion during that time. These monocrops are also more vulnerable to pests, right? If there is a certain, let's say, a certain fungus that preys on corn, right? If there's only one type of corn and you find the right fungus, or the right fungus evolves that likes that corn, it'll just devastate the crops. There's also issue for lacks of predators for certain organisms. Something evolves to eat the corn, it may not have a predator for that organism. We can see over time that the types of crops, the number of different varieties has reduced. So back in the early 1900s, there were lots of different varieties of cabbage and sweet corn, lettuce, radish, different squashes, and so forth. But then by the early 80s, the number of varieties of these crops was greatly reduced. There's actually a organization that stores heirloom seeds and heirloom plants, and they found that a lot fewer of these varieties are actually being grown in the last 30 to 40 years. So one issue that we talked about in population was whether there was going to be enough food for all the humans on the planet. And in general, we grow enough grain for up to 8 billion people. And of course, in the world, there are not yet 8 billion people. So overall, there's enough grain for everybody. But grain is only half the food we produce. And so what are the issues here? Why can't we feed everybody? Why are there still people who are hungry? So one of the reasons is poverty. So food is not scarce, but food is not equally distributed. And so not everybody is getting the food that they need. One reason is that they can't afford it. Economic access is part of the issue, right? We talked about how it costs money to get food from the farms to the grocery stores. So if you have grocery stores that are far from farms, it costs more to get that food there. It makes the food more expensive. You can see different states have different levels of food insecurity. In the South and Midwest, very high levels of food insecurity. Also in industrial areas, like former industrial areas, Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, food insecurity above the average. Political and economic factors also prevent people from getting food. If you have refugees, right, where there's political unrest, people are fleeing dangerous situations, right? They're not going to be able to get food because they're really not in one place. Poor governance is an issue. A lot of second and third world governments suffer from problems of corruption, right, where officials will direct the food where they want it to go and not necessarily where it needs to go. Another issue, like we said, there's enough grain to feed everybody, but not all this food, all this grain is going to people. A lot of it goes to livestock. And so what is the problem here? So let's say 40% of the grain in the world goes to livestock, but only 10% of the energy in that grain gets passed on to the next trophic level. So if you have 40% of that grain, the livestock that's eating it only retains 4% total of the energy, right? 10% of 40 is going to be 4%. So it's very inefficient use of the energy. So if we're going to feed all these people, what are we going to do? We need to put more land into agriculture production. But that's not necessarily good for the habitat, right? If we just keep mowing down forests, we're going to have problems with climate change due to increased carbon into the atmosphere. We could improve crop yields, right? We could make the land that we have more productive, make new techniques, invent new equipment. Maybe the biggest one is we could reduce our consumption of meat, and not just red meat, but any kind of meat. Because of the 10% rule, eating meat is extremely inefficient. Finally, we could try to harvest more from the world's fisheries. So when we say fisheries, we mean aquaculture and not just necessarily wild fish, because a lot of wild fish populations are in decline because of overfishing. So what are the challenges with all these increased production? Of course, we said climate change, right? If you increase cropland area, you're mowing down forests. You decrease biodiversity, right? If you're only making cows and pigs and chickens, that's less biodiverse than anything that was in that space before. Water supplies are not infinite, right? We'll talk about irrigation, but a lot of the aquifers where water is drawn from are not recharging as fast as we're using the water. If topsoil is diminished, that degrades our ability to grow crops in it. It's said that parts of the Midwest have lost anywhere from 2 to 4 feet of soil in the last 100 years. There's also cultural resistance, right? Not everybody wants to, continue agriculture in this way. We talk about GMOs, for example. Finally, corporate special interests, right, don't want things to change. Fossil fuel industry wants people to keep using the fossil fuels. Cattle industry wants to keep growing cattle. So there's powerful companies that lobby against any sort of change in the status quo. All right, so for section 5.4, talk about the impacts of these different agricultural practices. So these are specific ways that crops are grown. So one of these is plow and till. So what happens is it turns the soil upside down, and crop residues that were on top are pushed down. It's good at killing weeds and good at killing insects. But the problem is the soil becomes loose, right? So it increases erosion. More organic matter is exposed to oxygen, which increases the amount of CO2 due to oxidation. And so soil is degraded, right? It's degraded due to erosion. And as we will see, along with irrigation overproduction, like the soil will not be as productive if we do plow and till. Slash and burn, of course, this is more of an issue down in the rainforest. But if you just cut down everything, all trees and vegetation, and then you burn that ash, you leave the ash in place and the nutrients go to the soil. But here's the issue, right? Nutrient poor soil, right? That's in the tropical rainforests, warm climates. And so this is ultimately not sustainable because once you slash and burn those crops, then those nutrients, they don't come back, right? After you've, slash and burn the forest, grow your crops, they use the nutrients, no nutrients are coming back. All right, so obviously carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide are released from the burning. Without those original rainforest plants to hold the soil together, there's plenty of erosion, and this creates more erosion as the topsoil is eroded away and plants can't grow there. increased irrigation may lead to salinization of soil, right? High salt levels. And eventually you can just end up with a desert, right? Because if there's no plants there, there's no way for the soil to retain water and nothing can grow. So this is a big issue in places that are, of course, already deserts, right? Around the Sahara, it's expanding like 30 square miles a year just from people slashing and burning things around there. So fertilizers are a big part of agricultural production these days. So every fertilizer has a number or a set of numbers. For example, you can see the one on the bottom right has 18-24-6, and that's the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that are in that fertilizer. And so fertilizer is used to replace lost organic matter and nutrients, right? If you grow your crops, let's say you grow your corn, it takes up some nutrients and doesn't put them back, right? You harvest the crops, the nutrients are gone. So where are those nutrients going to come from? If you don't grow anything else there, the only way to get nutrients there is to fertilize it. Organic fertilizers are what we would like to use, right? And organic fertilizers are mostly manure, right? Animal waste that has nutrients on it that are good for plants. Of course, synthetic or inorganic fertilizers have issues, right? If you combust natural gas, you capture atmospheric nitrogen. That's how fertilizer is created, synthetically anyway. But the difference is the synthetic fertilizers feed the plants. You put the nutrients in the soil and the plants just suck them right up. The organic fertilizers are good because they put both organic matter and plant nutrients into the soil. The organic matter is broken down by microorganisms, so it supports more organisms than just the plants themselves, makes for healthier soil. So the use of fertilizer generally, right, it's usually pretty easily applied and absorbed in the soil. And the fertilizer content can be adjusted depending on what types of nutrients your crops need. So corn is different than soybeans, is different than fruits and other vegetables, right? They need different fertilizers, and fertilizers can be adjusted that way. The unfortunate fact is that without synthetic fertilizers, we wouldn't be able to produce the amount of food we're producing right now. It would not be as easy to do that. So some of the problems with organic fertilizers, problems with synthetic fertilizers. So it takes a lot of fossil fuels to make synthetic fertilizers, both in terms of just their creation, but then also, the movement of them. Synthetic fertilizers tend to over-add nutrients, right? It's hard to get the right amount of fertilizer, and a farmer is going to over-apply fertilizer rather than under-apply fertilizer. And so the extra fertilizer, the extra nutrients get carried off to groundwater, and they get carried off to waterways. And then, as we said before, a lot of these synthetic fertilizers, there's no organic matter that's part of them. And so without the organic matter, other organisms are not supported. The soil does not have a better ability to retain water without the organic matter. All right, so finally, for this screencast, let's talk about irrigation for agriculture. So we've talked about how very small amount of fresh water there is on the earth available for human consumption. And of that fresh water that we use, 70% of it goes to agriculture. So at least 15% of agricultural land is irrigated. Right, a lot of those small farms in Asia and India don't have the same irrigation systems that we do in the US. And even in the US, there's still a lot of places that rely on getting the right amount of rain every year because it's simply cheaper to get your water, your irrigation from the rain than it is to get it from, these big rolling sprayer things. Of that land that's irrigated, even though it's only 16%, it produces 40% of the world's food. So some of the problems, if you over-irrigate, right, if there's standing water on your fields, that's not good. Soil needs to have oxygen, and plants need the oxygen from the soil. So if the roots are waterlogged, they're not going to sustain the plant. Another problem is salinization, right? So water has stuff in it, different ions, including salts. And so if you sprinkle this water on the ground and then the water evaporates instead of going into the soil, then the salt remains behind. If you do this over enough years, the soil becomes too saline and it's toxic for plants. So a measure of irrigation efficiency is a percent of water that you're withdrawing, how much of that makes it to the plant roots, and is not lost to evaporation and is not lost to runoff. You can see here furrow irrigation, right, where you irrigate the water into the space between the crops, and the crops are on these little raised beds, so that allows them to get oxygen. Of course, problems with this include increased evaporation and maybe increased runoff. You can see these trenches, right? It's about 65% efficient. It's relatively low effort, but has problems with water logging and with salinization. Another type of irrigation is flood irrigation, surprisingly more efficient than the trenches. It's easy and cheap, but again, still has problems with water logging and salinization. Spray irrigation, right, where you pump water to nozzles and it gets sprayed over the fields, much more efficient, right, 75 to 95%, but it costs more, right? You have these mechanical systems that you have to maintain, and it also uses more energy because you have to use pumps to pump the water through the hoses to the sprayers. Drip irrigation, right? You run some hoses along your plant beds. You can see how this is similar to the furrow irrigation, except the water is in the hoses and not just laying out on the ground. So you slowly drip water from the hose, and the hoses can be on top or they can be buried in the furrows. This is highly efficient, right? It reduces weed growth because surface soil is usually dry, especially good for perennial crops. However, this costs the most money, right? You need a lot more hose because it's got to be in specific places. And you can't really plow your fields if you are planning on plowing them if there are a bunch of hoses in the ground. So in the US, a lot of the cropland that's in the Midwest, right? Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and so forth, irrigate their fields using water from the Ogallala Aquifer. This aquifer is huge, right? It spans 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 states. Mostly in Nebraska, but also big parts of Kansas and northern Texas and western Oklahoma. And you can see the thickness of this aquifer, right? In Nebraska, it's almost 1,000 to 1,200 feet thick. Even in Oklahoma, it's still hundreds of feet thick, right? That's a big, big aquifer. But here's the problem, is that we've been using it so much that the water level in the aquifer has declined pretty significantly. So especially in Texas, especially in southwestern Kansas, we've seen declines of 130 to 200 feet, which in those places is more than half the thickness of the aquifer. So this is one of the major problems that we face, especially in the US for irrigation, is that we don't have sustainable supplies of water for the amount of irrigation that we are doing. All right, well, that is screencast 5.3 through 5.5. Let me know if you have any questions.